I want to first off note that this is very much still work in progress, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means in a minute. But these are essentially progress reports from the longer work that we're still doing in this project. So you see all of that as the background to what I'm presenting here. The aims of what we're trying to do is to really move beyond this idea of fake news, and you'll see I'll use this in quotation marks all the way through, because obviously it's such a problematic and limiting term. What we're interested in is to understand the dissemination of problematic information much more broadly across all types of problematic information and across various social media platforms at scale. We in fact want to identify different types of problematic information by the way that they disseminate, by the dynamics of their dissemination, the audiences for their dissemination, and the themes that they represent as well. In this particular paper, we're focusing on problematic information on Facebook, so particularly the Facebook platform here, and we're looking over quite a lengthy period of time at the dynamics of content sharing. We're looking at some of the key events that are driving this, the domains that are particularly involved in this, and down the track we'll also look at the impact of takedowns, but that's not something that we'll focus on in this presentation. And particularly in this paper, we'll focus on the networks of interaction, the communities of interest that emerge from these networks, whether that's on thematic or ideological or geographic or other grounds. And all of this is part, and in fact, much of this whole panel is part of a discovery project on evaluating the challenge of fake news and other mis or malinformation. So let me say a little bit here about the data that we're working with. We've compiled essentially a master list of domains that have been flagged in various other existing studies of fake news. At the moment, that contains upwards of 2,300 domains from a whole bunch of previous papers that have done work in this space, and we will continue to extend this list as well. For this particular study, we've then drawn data from CrowdTangle, the Facebook-owned data access platform, and essentially captured any Facebook posts from public pages, public groups, or public verified profiles that contained links to any of these domains, starting from the beginning of 2016 to the end of March 2021. That data gathering continues, I have to say, and that's the reason why this is still work in progress. It simply takes quite a long time to gather this much data from CrowdTangle. So at the moment, we're building here on the data set for 1,500 out of these 2,300 domains, and that in itself is already 40.5 million Facebook posts from these public pages, groups, and verified profiles. There is a significant limitation here, obviously, in that CrowdTangle only covers these public, what I'll call public spaces from here, just to make it a bit easier for myself. So CrowdTangle does not provide data on non-public sharing of domains, non-public activity on Facebook. So that is an obvious limitation. And its coverage of fairly small spaces in terms of the number of followers is also incomplete or inconsistent. So we're not going down to spaces that have only a few hundred followers, but for our purposes, I think that's okay, because we're obviously interested in the broad patterns of dissemination, and the spaces with the largest numbers of followers will of course be the most consequential in this context. And of course, the fake news domain lists that we're building on are still largely US and Anglo-centric. We are trying to address this at this point, but that's also an obvious limitation that I should flag here. Okay, so what I'm presenting in this particular paper is work that we've done focusing on network analysis, and two types of network analysis particularly. The first is a bipartite network, where we're interested in the links between the spaces that have shared links to particular domains, and the structure of those networks. We expect to show clusters of spaces that commonly share the same domains, of course. We've then also conducted some computational content analysis to understand the content of the posts, the themes of the posts that are typically appearing in these clusters. Beyond that, we're also looking within our data set at on-sharing networks on Facebook. So where public spaces have shared other public spaces posts that happen to contain these links to problematic domains. That is a monopartite network, so a network between public spaces. And of course, the structure of that network is, again, expected to show common interests, beliefs, politics, ideologies, and so on amongst these spaces that are sharing each other's content. So let me jump right in. First, just a brief mention of the dynamics. So this is the dynamics of the overall data set, where we see an obvious up and down over these 4+ years. The big peaks happen in 2016, 2017 with the election and the inauguration of Donald Trump and all the controversy that follows. In 2020, of course, there's the impeachment, the first impeachment of Donald Trump, I should say, and then the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then down the track again, the election, the riots on the Capitol, and of course, the inauguration of Joe Biden. So that's the overall kind of activity really of sharing of links to these problematic domains over time. Now, I want to spend really most of my time here on the network analysis, so let me jump right into this, and we're focusing first on the link sharing network, so the spaces that share links to fake news domains. This is what that network looks like. So you're seeing quite obvious clustering tendencies. The large nodes here in red are largely the main domains that have been shared. In fact, if I overlay this, you'll see some of the domain names here, but that might be a little bit too small for you to read. So what I've done here is to pull out some of the key themes and key identifying markers of these clusters. And what emerges are two fairly large clusters, one of conservative politics, particularly focusing on US politics, and one of progressive politics. The conservative cluster breaks down a bit further, even into some sub-themes like the military, like pro-gun activism, like evangelist end times philosophies, and another separate evangelist cluster. We've got a handful of clusters that are particularly focused around countries other than the US and other Anglo countries. So we've got a French, a German, an Italian, and a Nigerian cluster particularly. And we've got a handful of clusters as well that are sitting somewhere between all of this that focus particularly on specific issues. So we've got anti-vaxxers, we've got climate change denialists, and we've got a kind of loose cluster of various conspiracy theories as well. Now, looking further at this and doing some computational textual analysis of the content in these clusters, I'll show you first actually just this is the cluster analysis itself, which shows that really these clusters obviously group together fairly clearly, but the conservative cluster in particular is somewhat complex, and there's a bunch of different themes that all intersect with each other. But looking at these clusters then more specifically, we've pulled out some of the key terms, and we've kept this quite simple for now until we've obviously got our full data set together. But you can already see as we're pulling out some of the key words even in these clusters. In the progressive cluster, you see Bernie Sanders, you see Trump, you see Democrats, Democratic, and so on, revolution, green, occupy. So some of the keywords that you'd expect in a cluster like that actually emerge quite clearly as well. The word county appears quite frequently as well, which presumably has something to do with election and electioneering as well, particularly. In the conservative cluster, well, we've got Trump and we've got America Conservative, Donald, of course, Patriots, Liberty, and so on, right, great, which is almost certainty from Make America Great Again. So we're seeing these sorts of terms appear quite strongly. In the pro-gun cluster, of course, gun, amendment, carry, firearms, second. So these are the sorts of terms that we see strongly there. In the end times cluster, well, we see Christian, Christ, Jesus, end times, prophecy, church, faith, country, and look, love is there too. So that's good, I guess. But these are the sorts of themes that appear quite strongly in these sorts of clusters. With the conspiracists, of course, we see terms like truth, health, chemtrails, anonymous, earth, natural, global, cannabis. So there's quite a few themes that are also related to, I guess, health-related conspiracy theories. And with the anti-vaxxers, of course, again, we see truth, stop, which often appears together with 5G, global, vaccine, anonymous, Trump appears there strongly as well, health, and so on. So these are, again, good indications of the sorts of themes that you'd expect in these kinds of clusters. And then in the clusters in other languages, in France particularly, we see Gilets jaunes appear, so the French Yellow Vest movement. In the German cluster, we see terms like Germany, free, politics, resistance, and also particularly AfD, which is the neo-fascist party in Germany at the moment. So that is a good indication of the sorts of topics that obviously we see in these clusters. Moving on very quickly to the Facebook Onsharing network from here. So again, that's the sharing of posts across spaces. Again, the patterns, the overall patterns are virtually identical to the patterns just in the domain sharing, but the network actually looks quite different. And this is because, of course, this is now about who's sharing another space's post rather than more broadly about what domains are being shared. We've colored this here by what CrowdTangle provides about the country of origin of at least the pages, and that's based on the majority location of admins. You're seeing the predominance, of course, of the United States, with some smaller clusters, particularly for Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Canada, Australia, and other countries as well. And again, looking at some of the key pages involved in this, there's quite a broad range, and reducing this again to some of the broader themes, we're still seeing some conservative and progressive overall clusters, but much more visibility of specific themes, topics, issues. So around the conservative cluster, particularly, there is a subcluster that's particularly pro-Trump, anti-Islam, pro-Brexit. There's a further away a Ted Cruz cluster, for all that's worth. And more towards the center of the network, and actually not so much related either to conservatives or progressives, but really much more also a connecting point, perhaps. We see clusters around alternative medicine, climate change denial, alternative nutrition, broader conspiracy theories, end times and finance, anti-vaxxers there as well. There's an anti-Brexit cluster as well. So again, quite a broad range of topics being covered here. And we will continue to delve further into the sorts of themes and topics that they're actually talking about. The other thing that appears here much more strongly are also clusters in particular languages or for particular countries, and you'll see them arranged around the network there, from Slovakian, Malaysian, Brazilian, French, Nigerian, Romanian, Chinese to Italian, and there's no doubt some others that I haven't particularly picked up on here. So we're seeing much more clustering here around themes and topics, but also shared geography and more local or national politics as well. So because I'm practically out of time, just some brief summaries here from this work. And again, I'll stress this is work in progress. Obviously, again, to just reiterate the limitations, these are public Facebook spaces only. We have no data on non-public groups. We have no data on ordinary profile activity, but we're hoping that these public spaces are at least somewhat representative and somewhat indicative of some of the broader activities going on below the waterline, if you like, in less visible spaces. Certainly, these are also some of the biggest groups and pages on Facebook, of course, and so they will have some significant impact. For now, we've only engaged in domain level analysis, so we're looking obviously also to move further towards analysis that focuses on article level. And again, the data set as yet is still incomplete, so we'll have a further update, of course, in the future once we've gathered all of our data. But generally, what we're seeing already here is that there's the general activity of the most active sharers of these links. That's what we're covering, but we will also extend this to looking more broadly at the posts by these pages and groups and so on, beyond sharing domains specifically. So what else are they posting about when they're not sharing links? We're interested in further thematic analysis, obviously, in changes over time, of course, longitudinally as well, beyond just the one-time snapshot of the network, and how that changes, particularly perhaps also around significant events like COVID or elections and so on. And of course, down the track, we'll also start to compare this with data from other platforms. But hopefully this gives you already a good indication of the sort of activity that actually exists on Facebook as people are sharing these problematic domains. And I'll leave it there. I'll thank our funders and supporters, and I'll hand over to whoever comes next.
Thanks, Axel, for the really interesting presentation.